afternoon. I want to speak today about my instrument, the cornetto. It was an instrument that in the 16th and 17th centuries was thought to have a unique kinship with the human voice, an ability to imitate words and the expression of a singer better than any other instrument. One writer, as we will see, even used the word lascivious to describe its character. But I want to start the story in 1938 with a description from a book on musical instruments by a man named H.W. Schwartz. And here's what he has to say about the cornetto. If ever an instrument belonged to the lower strata of society, the cornetto did. They were the poor white trash among musical instruments. Not only were they cheaply made, but they were noted for their poverty of musical qualities. Constructed of wood and covered with leather, their tone was colorless, coarse, and windy. Anyone with a pocket knife, a pot of glue, and a thin skiver of leather could make one of these instruments. Their tone was dull and windy, but for some strange reason, it became extremely popular. So I think from this passage, it's pretty clear what happens to the reputation of an instrument when it goes entirely out of use. Now, you might ask, what is the cornetto doing in a festival devoted to the trumpet? The cornetto is not a trumpet, of course, though it has points of convergence and non-convergence with the trumpet. It's technically a horn, of course, and that's why it's called a cornetto. But it's sounding, and it shares the tessitura with the trumpet. But its sounding length is only about a tenth that of the trumpet. And I think that the cornetto's vocality has a lot to do with its extremely short sounding pipe and the flexibility that gives the player. Now, reviving a dead instrument produces many challenges, but also a lot of stimulation and satisfaction, which has filled the last 45 years of my life. And for me, I want to make some rather personal comments this afternoon about what has motivated me and what has kept me motivated in this path of rediscovering this instrument. For me, it's a constant process of trying to get close to the players of earlier centuries, to feel the texture of their lives, to come in contact with common materials, the instruments and mouthpieces they played, the parts and part books they played from, the organ lofts they stood on, the sounds they heard from those organs. Not in order to reconstruct that world, exactly, we can't do that, but for me, this point of contact, this attempt to find points of contact, which are like little pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, trying to put it together and imagine what this musical world was like, that has been a huge source of stimulation and motivation to me. I'll give you an example. You might think this is a rather trivial example. This is on the inside of the organ case of the organ, Lorenzo da Prato organ in San Petronio in Bologna, which is one of the oldest church organs in the world from 1470 something. And this is a signature carved on the inside of the organ case in 1575 by a cornetto player named Paolo Antonio Gongini. I would say, okay, a trivial thing, a bit of graffiti. But I find standing there inside that organ case and seeing this bit of graffiti and touching it and trying to imagine what was going through the mind of Paolo Antonio Gongini when he was standing there. He's probably waiting for his moment to step out of the organ case onto the organ loft and play together with the organ at the appropriate point of the Mass. And that makes me feel a real connection to him, even though I don't know anything more about him. Less perhaps trivial, more informative points of contact are things like this, museum instruments. These are cornetti in the Accademia Filarmonica in Verona, and they can provide us with all kinds of information about pitch and temperament and sound and fingering. And you also notice, I don't know if you can see them well enough, but you could notice that every one of these cornetti, except one, curves to the left, rather than the curve to the right, which we're familiar with from our modern instruments. In fact, something like a third of surviving museum instruments do curve to the left. And that's a very interesting piece of information to speculate on. We have about 380 surviving cornetti. Here's another mute cornet, a straight mute cornet from the same collection. Here we are in the Accademia Filarmonica of Bologna, looking at a very interesting but incomplete instrument, a copy of which I played in the concert here on Sunday evening. And then musical parts, part books, manuscript parts, manuscript scores. I think it's really important to look at these things, and if possible, not digital reproductions, but to have them in your hands, to feel them, what the paper feels like, what does it smell like, smell the ink and the dust, and get a sense of how big they were and how they might have been used by the players. I think it's a very exciting thing to do. This is in Kromežiš in Moravia. Some of my students. And then organ lofts, organs, historical organs. In Italy we have a huge wealth of them. This one's in Bologna, in the church where Adriano Banchieri played the organ. And here's a group of students playing from the organ loft, and you see how much you learn about the way they made music just by seeing the dimensions of the loft and what instruments can fit there and how you relate to each other. Another example near Bergamo, a beautiful organ which is in 440 mean tone, quarter-gamma mean tone, from 1588. And an incredible instrument north of Venice in the town of Valvasone, which is at a pitch of A492, quarter-gamma mean tone. So you learn a lot about pitch, what it means to play a cornetto at that pitch, and what it feels like to play with the organ. And big part of my idea about the cornetto has to do with the relationship between the cornetto and the organ. Because the Italians said often, suonare nell'organo, or cantare nell'organo, to play in the organ. They didn't say play with the organ or play on the organ, but to play in the organ. Because if you are a single cornetto standing in one of these beautiful organ lofts, playing with the organ, you feel as though you become part of the organ. You are in the organ. It's like Roger North said, it was Samuel Pepys who said the cornetto gives life to the organ. That's a really incredible experience for a cornetist if you can get an access to one of these 16th century or 16th or 17th century organs. So, who were the players of this instrument? I'd like to spend most of my time today profiling some important cornetto players, and through them tracing the history and decline of the instrument, hoping along the way to catch a glimpse of the nature of these musicians' lives, and in so doing to touch also on their diversity, a theme which is very much a part of this festival. Now, the man on the right in this picture, Joachim Christoph Mandischer, may well have been the last surviving cornetist in the 19th century. Maybe not, but he was one of the very last. And he's the last one that we have any documentary evidence about. He He was born in Lübeck in 1774, and he died there in 1860. He became organist, Ratsmusiker, and Türmer of the Marienkirche in Lübeck in 1796, and he held this position until his retirement in 1856. This daguerreotype here shows the 4 organists of the main Lübeck churches, and Mandischer can be seen on the lower right-hand corner. 1856, think about that. Now, when did we start playing the cornetto in the 20th century? I think it's quite likely that this man in the next picture was the first one to play the cornetto live in front of an audience in the 20th century. Paul Hindemith. Here he's seen rehearsing in an instrument collection, probably in Berlin, I think, and he's playing a mute cornet in the very front there. It's a bit warped, so it doesn't look like a mute cornet. And there's another picture of him playing a curved cornet from the same time, the same year, which is 1933. I have a little bit of a personal connection to this idea of Hindemith playing the cornetto because I was once talking with Nicolas Arnoncourt, the conductor, and he said, you know, I mentioned that I had seen that Hindemith played the cornetto, and he said, I played with him in a performance of Orfeo in the early 1950s. And I said, that's really quite amazing and fascinating. What did it sound like? And he, without hesitation, said, ganz schrecklich. Just disgusting. Not so surprising, coming out of this 60-year gap between the end of a playing tradition and starting a new one. And I don't think that Herr Mandischer in 1865 was probably much better, because this was the very end of a long decline of the instrument. So I'd like to go back now to the high point of the cornetto's development in the middle of the 16th century and take a stroll along the instrument's path to obsolescence. In doing this, we will have a view of this diversity that I was talking about. We'll find consummate and widely praised artists and virtuosi, noblemen, humble artisans, women, many but not all of them nuns, African slaves in South America, teaching masters, apprentices, journeymen, rogues, and drunks, a couple of murderers, and devout Christian missionaries. But let's start with a great artist, not necessarily a great artist on the cornetto, but Benvenuto Cellini was a consummate sculptor, goldsmith, jeweler, and by his own accounting in his autobiography, an unwilling but excellent cornetto player. And in any case, evident in Cellini's descriptions of his engagement with the cornetto is that quality which accounted for this instrument's unusual popularity, a unique expressiveness rivaling the sensuousness of the human voice. Cellini's virtuosity on the cornet cannot be verified, but his comments emphasize this expressive vocal quality. Now, according to his autobiography, Cellini's father was an engineer and a designer who so fell in love with music and with playing the flute that he neglected his true profession. At a very early age, Benvenuto's father began teaching him to play the flute, but Cellini assures us he found nothing but extreme displeasure in this activity. His father persisted, anyway, with his musical plans for the young Benvenuto. According to Benvenuto, his father said to him one day, "My dear boy, in my time, I was a good draftsman too, but as a delightful rest from the hard work it calls for, and for the sake of your father who brought you into the world and looked after you and sowed the seeds of all your splendid talents, won't you promise sometimes to take your flute and that very lascivious cornetto, quel lascivissimo cornetto, and amuse yourself playing them with delight and pleasure?" At the age of 16, with the sponsorship of Cardinal de' Medici, later Pope Clement VII, and to the great joy of his father, Cellini was sent to Bologna to study music. He studied with a man named Maestro Ercole del Pifaro. And he says, all the same, I used to go along every day for my music lessons, and within a few weeks, I had made very good progress in that cursed art. But I reaped a great deal more from being a goldsmith, no doubt. When I read Cellini's descriptions, I'm brought to mind of this beautiful portrait of a young man holding a cornetto, drawn by Jacopo da Pontormo in the 1540s. To me, it captures some of the expressivity bordering on erotic lasciviousness hinted at by Cellini. Cellini would have been 16 years old in 1516. And he was an exception among cornetto players of his time, although pursuing the cornetto as a secondary activity, we can't really say hobby since he so detested it, he succeeded by his own accounts in attaining a high professional level. Generally speaking, cornetto virtuosi were professional players who followed a rigorous training and were highly specialized. The best of them were widely known and highly paid, sometimes better paid than even the chapel master. An example of this sort of professional virtuoso is the man named Luigi Zenobi, il Cavaliero del Cornetto. One of those who must have known and heard the best players of the instrument in its golden age was the theorist Vincenzo Giustiniani, who praised Zenobi glowingly in 1628. There are, moreover, many players of other instruments which I will not name, except for the Cavaliere Luigi del Cornetto of Ancona, who played the cornetto in one of my little rooms with a harpsichord which was completely closed and could barely be heard. And he played the cornetto with such moderation and correctness that it astonished many music-loving gentlemen who were present, because the sound of the cornetto did not exceed that of the harpsichord. Zenobi was from Ancona on Italy's Adriatic coast and was already in the service of Emperor Maximilian II at the age of 22. In 1570, he was set to marry a Sienese singer of noble birth. The wedding was called off because her father did not approve of her marrying someone of lower birth. This disappointment had a profound effect on Zenobi. For the rest of his life, he was constantly searching recognition and better financial conditions. He didn't want to be seen as a mere musician. He wrote poetry. Here we see a title page of a book of poems that he wrote and published. And he painted. And his efforts led eventually to his being named Cavaliere. After many political machinations, he ended up in Ferrara at the musically progressive Este Court, where he played cornetto, led the so-called Concerto Grande, a large ensemble that played at court celebrations, and advised the Duke on singers. Eventually, his demands wore thin on the Este Court, and he was sent away, protesting for his back pay. Some years later, in Naples, where he complains bitterly of his reduced state, he replied to the letter of an unknown nobleman, asking him what was required of the perfect musician. He responded with an amazing letter, a virtual treatise on the art of being a musician in 1600. After discussing at length the art of ornamentation, he says of the cornetto, "It is true that of players of wind instruments more is required than of singers, for they must know the quality, the quantity, and variety of tonguings, the perfection of the instrument, and the forte and piano when needed, but they must cultivate the piano more than the forte, since the former serves for the chambers of princes and in places of respect, and it is the main mode for disclosing the defects and the excellence of the player, which does not occur in bandstands and in chapels and wherever one plays as loud as one can, because there the people have little understanding and experience of anything. The same is true for the great concerts, the concerti grandi, which make a great din and cause all the blunders, mistakes, the poor intonation, and the ignorance of the players on wind or stringed instruments to slip by unnoticed." We should note that Zenobi, as well as most cornetists, would have played more often in the concerti grandi than in the chambers of princes. I like to imagine Zanobi, though, that he aspired to play the highly ornate vocal music of Luzzasco Luzzaschi, who was the chapel master at the court in Ferrara, and which was vocal music that was sung by the famous Concerto delle Donne, the women's concert, at the Ferrarese court. Here's my version of one such piece that I can imagine Zanobi might have played or wanted to play, aspired to play. This is Luzzaschi's O Primavera. Another famous cornetist, not far down the road from Ferrara in Bologna, was Ascanio Trombetti, better known as Ascanio del Cornetto. An important figure in the famous Concerto Palatino of Bologna, and maybe a better example than Zanobi of the typical Italian 16th century wind player. The Concerto Palatino existed from 1530 until 1779 in a formation of 8 trumpets, 4 cornetti, and 4 trombones. Though it must be said that the trumpets and the cornetti and trombones never played together. Trombetti, from a family of wind players, as his name reveals, was almost certainly the greatest Bolognese cornetist of all time. He was also an accomplished composer, and we have a portrait of a cornetist with his father, which I am convinced portrays Ascanio and his father. I just love the way he's looking at us, showing us his mouthpiece as if to say, hey, this is the way I put it on my lips, and he's just about to start playing. Alas, Ascanio came to a tragic end. He carried on an affair with the wife of a bookseller in Bologna, and he was caught in flagrante, as they say, by the jealous husband. He was murdered, and his body was deposited on the doorstep of his house, just several blocks from where I used to live in Bologna. I'd like to play just 2 minutes of one of Trombetti's motets for 4 cornetti and 4 trombones, which was the classic instrumentation of the Concerto Palatino. This is played by my group, the modern-day Concerto Palatino. Not all cornetists, not even all professional cornetists, were white males. Here we see an unknown noblewoman with what looks to be a cornettino. At the same time that Ascanio Trombetti was flourishing in Bologna, a little further north, two daughters of the musician Antonio Pellizzari, Lucia and Isabella Pellizzari, were hired by the Accademia Olimpica in Vicenza to sing and to play cornetto and trombone. This unusual arrangement for two young noble women stipulated that the due putte sorelle were each awarded a salary of 20 ducats a year on the condition that they, along with their brother Antonio, would provide music for the Academy twice a week on a regular basis, and at any other times that might be necessary. And although their duties for the Academy seem to have included singing and giving singing lessons to several little girls, they were best known for their instrumental abilities, especially on cornetto and trombone. On several different occasions, they were said to have especially amazed the audience at the Teatro Olimpico with their skill on these instruments. And in 1582, they were likely heard by the music-loving Duke Guglielmo Gonzaga of Mantova. Here's another noble woman in Alsace. Most young women who are known to have played the cornetto or the trombone in the 16th or 17th centuries in Italy were cloistered nuns. Musical chapels in Italian cloisters were some of the largest and most renowned in Italy, especially during plague years. Though most instruments, apart from the organ, were generally not allowed to the nuns, there were many exceptions. One of the most famous of the nun convent musical chapels was at San Vito in Ferrara. Here at San Vito, two nuns, Raffaella de' Magnifici and one of the Catabene sisters, were described as suonatrici di cornetto singolari, singular cornetto players. Here's a description from 1594 of music in the musical chapel at San Vito. Watching them enter the room, where a long table had been prepared, at one end of which was a large harpsichord, you would see them come in slowly, one by one, each carrying her instrument, be it a stringed instrument or a wind, for they play all kinds. And they take their places at that table without making the slightest noise. Those sitting, who must sit to play, and the others remaining standing. Lastly, the concert mistress seats herself at the other end of the table, and with a long, slender, and elegant rod, which has been set before her, which she is sure that when she is sure that the other sisters are ready, she silently gives them the sign to begin, and then beats the time, which they obey in singing and playing. There were, if I remember correctly, 23 of them who participated at that time in the large ensemble. And one heard with great beauty and harmonic sweetness cornetti, trombones, violins, viole bastarde, double harps, lutes, crumhorns, flutes, harpsichord, and voices all at one time. And it truly seemed to be Mount Parnassus and paradise itself opening up rather than something human. It has been many months and years since I have heard any ensemble united as well as this. The musicologist Larissa Brewer Garcia has reported on 17th century testimony regarding African slaves active in Cartagena, Colombia, playing instruments including cornetti and trombones in services, among other services, playing masses for the souls of people executed as criminals. Some of these slaves had been given names referring to their instruments, such as Andrea Saccabuce, Antonio Pifaro, and Francesco Basso. The one named Saccabuce leaves this testimony. After these condemned men had died, a very solemn responsory was played and sung to the organ, and in which all of the black men took part, Pifari and Basso and Cornetta of this collegio in 1659. And in another account, Father Ferdinando Cavallero, cleric and priest, now dead, sang the bass and spoke the oration. In the responses, Andrea Saccabuce played his said instrument, and Antonio Pifaro played the cornetto and Francesco Basso, who is already dead, played the bass. So these testimonies are quite brief, and many questions remain about them. Where did these African slaves learn to play their instruments? Presumably in Cartagena. How long did the practice continue, and what music was played and sung? All of those questions are still open. Moving back to Europe, I would like to show a few portraits of prominent cornetists. I find it endlessly fascinating staring into the faces of these historic players, trying to imagine their lives and how they must have played. Here's an anonymous cornetist in Bologna. Here's a Dutch man named Michiel Servesch-Nauts. He was carillonneur and cornetist of the city of Amsterdam in 1670. Gabriel Schütz was a Stadtpfeifer in Nuremberg. I also find it endlessly fascinating to study their mouthpieces, but I won't bore you with that right now. Here's an unknown player from Bergamo from the first half of the 16th century, which it looks to me like he forgot to put the mouthpiece in his instrument, and he's just about to discover it when he starts to play the first note. And this, this player in a Dutch tavern playing, of all things, a cornettino with what looks like a bottle of Genever handy to help the playing of the instrument. Already in the first decades of the 17th century, the stage was set for the cornetto's long, inexorable decline. Partly it was the arrival of another instrument, the violin, to cause this fate. For several decades, these two instruments shared a common repertoire and function. Much of the published music indicates for violin or cornetto. But the violin was a newcomer into chapels and court orchestras, while the cornetto was beginning to look a bit old-fashioned. Violinists were experimenting with new techniques that led further and further from the vocal model. Double stops, huge leaps, arpeggiation. And then there was the plague. By 1640, cornetto playing in Venice had declined, largely because of the plague of 1630, to a point where the officials of St. Mark's found it necessary to take action, stating that the cornetto had been absent for some time, not only from the musical chapel of St. Mark's, but indeed from all the churches of Venice. Stipends were offered to two members of the chapel, a singer and a violinist, to encourage them to practice the cornetto. This first attempt seems to have failed, and they tried again in 1643. Eventually, two players were accepted in the chapel, but their short period of training indicates that the days of brilliant cornetto virtuosi in St. Mark's were clearly past. In Bologna, another center of cornetto playing, the instrument seems to have flourished somewhat longer. Bologna possessed the famous ensemble Concerto Palatino, which existed until 1779. And at that time, the city fathers voted to silence the Concerto Palatino, claiming that they needed to remove the unpleasantness which results from hearing in the public functions, and above all in the churches, a very disagreeable dissonance from which derives a manifest scandal. So the future was sealed. And yet, even in the midst of this waning popularity, there were surprising pockets of high-level playing. This was a long, uneven decline with many twists and turns. In Naples, the cornetto seems to have enjoyed a particular popularity in the last decade of the 17th century, especially in opera. Giovanni Bononcini and Alessandro Scarlatti, among others, wrote obligato parts for the instrument in a number of operas. We don't know anything about who the players were, but they must have been highly skilled. Listen to part of an aria from Scarlatti's opera Il Comodo Antonino of 1696. The cornetto survived longer in northern countries than in the south. After 1600, a striking influx of Italian musicians into Germany created a great flowering of cornetto playing there, which lasted through most of the 17th century. By 1700, however, the cornetto was definitely beginning to be regarded as old-fashioned. More and more, the instrument was no longer the province of professional virtuosi, but of humble town musicians. Matizon writes in 1713 that the slight use of this instrument nowadays does not merit that anyone particularly apply himself to it anymore, and so waste his breath in this activity. In the churches, the cornetto held out now and then, but otherwise they were seldom to be seen. Where cornetti were heard, they are described as loud, rather rough instruments played with tremendous effort. But there is evidence that in some places, most notably in Stuttgart, the profession of cornetist continued far longer and more vigorously than most of us have imagined. I recently discovered and was able to purchase original copies of the Rules of the Stuttgart Cornetists' Guild, published in 1721 and reprinted in 1758. Here you see the title page of the 1721 version. These rules regulate the teaching of the instrument, the requirements for students, their apprenticeship, their period as a journeyman, and the allocation of cornetists, whether masters, apprentices, or journeymen, to the jobs readily available: weddings, funerals, dances, church services. The implication is that there were enough masters and aspiring young players and enough work in 1721 and again in 1758 to make such regulation necessary and desirable. Still further to the north, in Norway, the cornetto enjoyed an even later flowering. In 1744, well, here's the title page of the 1758 version. In 1744, the German immigrant Stadtpfeifer and organist Johann Daniel Berlin published in Trondheim a treatise on the instruments in which he speaks of the cornetto. He says, "The cornet is generally used in loud and splendid music, and accompanied by or together with trombones, it is employed on the highest part when there is no soprano trombone. However, even in such a case, one still prefers the cornetto to the soprano trombone, because the cornetto can play with graces. One will find only a few who can manage to play the cornetto well. The reason is that great strength is required to meet the demands of the cornetto properly. Many thus find it extremely difficult." Here we see some pages from his method book on the cornetto, a fingering chart, the second latest fingering chart that I know. Apparently, Berlin did find some players who could manage the instrument exceedingly well, because a sinfonia by Berlin for cornetto and strings exists in a manuscript in Trondheim. And it's extremely demanding on the player, who must play to the very top of the instrument's range and negotiate difficult leaps in a thoroughly galant manner. Listen to a movement of this work played masterfully by cornetist Alexandra Opsahl. repeat with even more ornaments, a piece that would not be impossible to play on the trumpet, I think. And the cornetto was still heard in Norway in 1782, as Lorentz Berg relates in his method book. This instrument, he says, is not very well known except among musicians. Only very rarely does one get to hear a cornetist. I myself have only heard one who knew how to play the instrument well. A musician journeyman who, like myself, was serving with the city musicians in Copenhagen. It is used in church music together with trombones for chorales, etc. That is a magnificent kind of music, and the cornetto can be also heard over a full organ. On the cornetto, one plays the melody. It has a great similarity to a strong, penetrating human voice. The image of a simple village musician blowing obviously very hard on his cornetto is captured amusingly by Berg in an anecdote he says was well known at the time. Once upon a time, a farmer in the city saw someone playing on a cornetto, and in telling his neighbors some of the things he had seen, he said, "Some were blowing with their cheeks on a rod, another was biting on a sausage which was 7/4 long. He was biting pieces out of the sausage. I truly believe the sausage was very hot, for his fingers went up and down every time he bit, and his eyes were popping out like stones." So the cornetto has come to a humble ending here, I think, compared to the lascivious description of Benvenuto Cellini. But it's quite complicated to follow this decline with all of its twists and turns and all the geographical differences. But it was clear that it was all generally in decline since the mid-17th century. So that's what I have to present. And I don't know what time it is, so I don't know. We go. Perfect. So now I would ask the participants of the workshop to take these chairs on the stage while I say something about the project. I have to stay here, right? For these 2 days, it's been a very brief amount of time, but the idea was to explore experimentally this area of convergence between the cornetto, the world of the cornetto, and the world of the trumpet, and in particular, in this case, the modern trumpet, and see not just in terms of repertoire and pieces that could be played on trumpets that properly belong to the cornetto, but also to see to what extent we could apply certain ideas and principles that are so much a part of cornetto playing to the trumpet. And I mean by that, in particular, the vocality, the imitation of the human voice. And I've tried to impress on the students that playing vocally does not mean playing in a singing manner or playing cantabile, but rather it means making the notes that you play sound like words, speaking through your instrument. We've worked on that a certain amount over the past 2 days, playing some motets, pieces for 4 soprano voices. These were probably pieces that were sung by nuns in the convents. They didn't have tenor and bass voices, and so they're all high parts. And we've worked on 2 motets, one by Orazio Benevoli, Di Rupisti Domine, and the other one by Giuseppe Giamberti, Similabo Eum. So we'll perform those 2 motets, and I hope that you can imagine that you hear something of the cornetto in their playing. That was the goal. And then we will play a canzona of Samuel Scheidt, which is the canzone cornetto for 4 cornetti. So let's take place for the rupisti. I neglected another part of the work we did in these 2 days, which was to work on ornamenting cadences. We only just got to the first steps of that because we didn't have really enough time, but we did do exercises by an Italian singer, Antonio Brunelli, ornamenting cadences, and also practicing a kind of articulation that was very much favored by singers and instrumentalists, where all moving notes have a kind of inequality, a kind of good note, bad note alternation. So we worked a fair amount on that idea, and trying to apply that also to these pieces.